Hello and welcome to the 18th episode of Criminal Profiling. Today we're going to look into the life of Thomas Dillon, who was a serial sniper who shot outdoorsmen in random motiveless attacks. In each case, he never left any casings or evidence. These random shootings with a high-powered rifle would claim 5 to 11 victims between 1989 and 1992. Dillon was captured in November 1992 when a friend recognized a behavioral profile put out by the FBI. Gun ballistics matched him to 5 victims, which he pled guilty to. Because the victims were from various states, such as Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan, United States, the authorities didn't connect the murders, and in at least one case, a murder was blamed on a hunting accident. To avoid the death penalty, Dillon pleaded guilty to 5 counts of murder and received 30 years to life for aggravated murder, no chance of parole for 165 years. Here's a little bit about Thomas Dillon. He worked as a draftsman for a municipal water department and held a college degree. He liked to cruise the back roads of southeastern Ohio, pretending he was something he was not. In his fantasy life, Dillon pretended he was a multimillionaire, a life-saving scientist who cured AIDS, or a Super Bowl winning quarterback. Frequently driving hundreds of miles immersed in his own thoughts, Dillon also liked to envision himself as a special forces soldier, out hunting for enemies. And this, of course, would cross over into real life. The victims were composed of 2 hunters, 2 fishermen, and a jogger. The first victim was the jogger, Donald Welling, only 35 years old, shot at close range, about 5 feet. Dillon would insist that the murders weren't premeditated, that a voice in his head would prompt him to shoot these victims. The second victim was 21-year-old Jamie Paxton, who was shot while hunting. The third victim was 30-year-old Kevin Loring, who was also shot while hunting on November 28, 1990. The fourth murder was of 49-year-old Claude Hawkins, a blue-collar father of 4 shot while fishing on March 14, 1992. Dillon would later say that, "I drove by and he waved at me. I heard a voice that day that said, 'Go back and get him.' And he did." The fifth victim was Gary Bradley, aged 44 and the father of 3. He was shot while fishing in April 1992. As Dillon would later state, his hat blew straight up about 20 feet. "I knew I had to blow his whole head off." All of Dillon's victims were shot on a weekend except for Kevin Loring, the third victim, who was shot on a Wednesday while Dillon was on vacation. The grieving mother of 21-year-old victim Jamie Paxton wrote to Dillon in the newspaper over and over, until one day Dillon replied. It was this letter that alerted authorities to the fact they were looking for a serial killer. Dillon blamed the shootings on an irresistible compulsion that has taken over my life, he claimed. He also stated that he knew someone would die that day by his hand, which is kind of like premeditated murder, isn't it? He also stated that he thought no more of shooting Paxton than shooting a bottle at the dump. In his younger years, Dillon began acting out against animals and started setting fires to appease his demons. He would later admit to setting more than 100 fires and killing more than 1,000 pets and farm animals. The childhood friend of Dillon, who recognized him from the FBI profile, whose name was Richard Fry, stated that as teens, the 2 men would drive through the countryside taking shots at road signs and animals and lighting small fires. But Fry recalled that Dillon began getting more violent and cruel by shooting family pets they happened across. The FBI took this lead and followed Dillon for about a month and watched him buy guns, drive around aimlessly and shoot at stop signs, animals, electric meters, and even take pot shots at populated areas. He also visited the grave of his third victim, Kevin Loring. Thomas Dillon was a married man with a son, and he would later die in prison on October 21, 2011, of an unspecified illness. The FBI concluded that Dillon was an educated white male in his 20s. They were, of course, wrong about this. He was actually in his 40s, with a predilection for crimes such as arson and killing pets and farm animals. Lived a short distance from the crime scene. He might be a nominal family man, but likely a loner in life. He had a drinking problem and a history of compulsive crimes, such as vandalism and arson. Stress would trigger the shootings, which would usually be committed while he was drunk. And that concludes a very brief synopsis of Thomas Dillon's life. We can now start looking at the chart. We're going to start the interpretation at a point where we know about the red truck, the suspicious man with the gun pointing it at a fisherman. We know about the letter that's been sent in by Dillon to both the second victim's mother as well as to the press and police. So they've now connected the 5 murders to one serial sniper, and the FBI has already submitted their profile of the offender. Dillon's high school friend, Richard Fry, has also read this FBI report and has gone to the FBI with his concerns and shared some information with them. This information, of course, would include Dillon's obsession with serial killers, his driving around like he's still in high school, shooting everything in sight and being reckless. This includes Dillon's asking Richard if he thought he could ever kill someone, and then to go on and say this is how you would do it and not get caught. And it raised a lot of suspicions for Richard Fry. However, the FBI has just learned about Richard Fry and has not yet begun to tail him. The 4 words I've chosen to begin with are sniper, opportunistic, guns, and compulsive behavior. The reason I feel comfortable using the word sniper, it's not just because he's seen as a serial sniper in the eyes of the law, but because of the MO itself. We have a guy who, in the last 4 shootings at least, is sneaking up on his potential victim, and he's shooting them from a distance, much like one sneaks up and hunts down an animal. The offender doesn't confront the victims at all. In fact, he tries to remain completely hidden, and this would be represented by Pisces, 12th house, Neptune as well. Although you generally wait until you have all your words before you separate suspects, we'll do this one word at a time. So we would go ahead and we would separate all the suspects who have afflictions within Pisces, the 12th house, or with Neptune. And this would include all conjunctions, because we need to look at those to see if they're positive or negative conjunctions. This being done, we would pull out whatever remaining charts, and we would in fact still have Thomas Dillon in our pile. And the reason is, we would find that Thomas has Jupiter in Pisces opposite Saturn in Virgo, the opposition being an affliction. We would also find Mars and Neptune in the 12th house, and the Sun is square Mars, Mercury is square Mars, and Mars is square Uranus and conjunct Neptune. So many afflictions there. Lastly, Neptune. We have the Sun square Neptune, the Moon in conjunct Neptune, Mercury square Neptune, and as we've already mentioned, the Mars conjunct Neptune. We'll cover the meanings of all this and get into Thomas's personality in part 2. Right now, here in part 1, we just want to separate suspects. Next word up is opportunistic, which fits the MO of the individual who drives around great distances, waiting for the right opportunities to present themselves and to take advantage of those opportunities when they do arise. In Dillon's chart, we find that Jupiter is opposite Saturn, the Sun conjunct Uranus, Mars square Uranus. So his chart would be pulled as well from this group. I chose to use guns because it is the offender's only weapon that we know of being used in all of the murders. He's a good shot, so he's an experienced and skilled marksman or hunter. He's also tactical, which is reflected by Mars as well. And what we get is the Sun square Mars, Mercury square Mars, Mars square Uranus, Mars conjunct Neptune. And just to point this out, Mars conjunct Neptune is one of those conjunctions that could potentially have a negative outcome. Next word up is compulsive in terms of behavior. And we've got that, and I've chosen that because we've got it from so many different directions. We've got the suspect himself, Dillon, in the letter to the victim's mother, claiming that he kills due to irresistible compulsion. The FBI in their profile mentions compulsive vandalism. And Richard Fry, his high school friend, describes compulsive behavior when he was hanging out with Dillon. This is a great example of when you can use a word as a primary 100% word and separate suspects with it. Because here, the word compulsive, we have the suspect himself using it, we have the FBI using it in their profile, and we have his high school friend using it. So those 3 combined make for a great 100% word. However, compulsive in this instance is ruled by Uranus. It's not to be confused with Aries or or Mars, because here we're looking at compulsive behavior, childish behavior. But Aries can be compulsive and childish as well. But the difference is Aries is very directed, where here we're looking at someone who's much more random and childish in that way. He's also more reckless, which is Uranus rather than Jupiter. So we can safely disregard Aries. Because we've already separated those suspects with an afflicted Uranus when we did the word opportunistic, we don't need to redo that. Our primary suspect should still be in our primary list of suspects. I couldn't use animal cruelty as a way to separate suspects with, because all we have for animal cruelty is the word of his high school friend and the FBI saying that the offender would have a predilection for crimes such as arson or killing pets and farm animals. So that isn't strong enough as it is to use as a primary word to separate suspects with. The only difference between a tentative word and a 100% word is that with a tentative, no charts get removed from the list. So for our first tentative word, animal cruelty, we're looking into whether Thomas Dillon has a predilection for violence against pets or farm animals. This is how the FBI put it. So it could be, we could be looking into, for domestic animals, we'd look into Virgo, the 6th house, and Mercury. For non-domestic animals, we'd be looking more into the Pisces 12th house or Neptune. Because it is looking like this guy might be shooting people's pets into his 40s, I might want to center in on Virgo in the 6th house and Mercury. So first with the afflictions for Virgo, we have Saturn in Virgo opposite Jupiter. And for Mercury, we have Mercury in Cancer in the 9th house. And Mercury is square Mars. And Mercury is conjunct Uranus and square Neptune. If we were to include non-domestic animals, there are plenty of afflictions to do with Pisces, the 12th house, and Neptune. The FBI profile mentioned that stress triggers shootings, so that's something we can look up as a tentative. And for stress, of course, we're looking at Mars, and we get the Sun square Mars, Mercury square Mars, Mars square Uranus, and Mars conjunct Neptune. Mars square Uranus is particularly important because Mars represents not only stress, but actions. And Uranus, we found, is behind the MO of Thomas Dillon. It represented the opportunistic nature. It represented the compulsiveness, the recklessness, the childishness. After the FBI started trailing Dillon, they confirmed the behaviors of recklessness, shooting at everything, shooting into populated areas, shooting domestic animals, shooting utility meters, just reckless abandonment, shooting stop signs. So we could have used recklessness at this point as a 100% word, which is ruled by Uranus. So it's actually not necessary because we've already separated those suspects with an afflicted Uranus. Again, Aries or Mars doesn't represent the sort of recklessness I'm looking for. Another tentative word we could look up is fantasizing. If it is true that he fantasized about being a multimillionaire or a scientist who cures AIDS or a Super Bowl quarterback or a special forces soldier out on a mission. So if in fact he is still doing these things and he's in his 40s and there's that much of a focus on this kind of behavior, and it's been going on for years, it should be something that stands out in his chart. So for this, you would be looking for Neptune specifically. This is the planet of the imagination. And for Thomas Dillon, we get the Sun square Neptune, the Moon in conjunct Neptune, Mercury square Neptune, and Mars conjunct Neptune. Fantasies are particularly reflected with Mercury square Neptune and the Moon in conjunct Neptune, if it truly is, if the time of birth is correct. The FBI mentioned that the suspect could be a nominal family man, so we can always look into that tentatively. And what we get is 3 planets in Cancer. Of course, family is ruled by Cancer, the 4th house, and the Moon. And what we get, of course, is a strong focus in Cancer, the Sun, Mercury, and Uranus in Cancer. The FBI predicted that the offender would be intelligent. And looking at the chart, we can find the Sun conjunct Mercury, conjunct Uranus, forming a small stellium in Cancer in the ninth house of higher education, etc. Stelliums often indicate a person who is quite intelligent. Some people may be wondering where murder comes into this. Where is that indicated that Dillon can cross that line into the realm of murder? And two things stand out in that sort of sense, and it's Venus in Gemini square Saturn in Virgo, as well as Jupiter in Pisces opposite Saturn in Virgo. And this all boils down to a lack of empathy, both for people, as Venus in Gemini, as well as domestic animals, Saturn in Virgo, and wild animals, Jupiter in Pisces. So I'm just going to recap things and bring us up to speed here. We had 4 primary words to begin with, which is a good number. We had serial sniper or sniper. We had opportunistic, guns, compulsive. With the sniper, we needed something in Pisces, 12th house, or Neptune. We had Mars conjunct Neptune in the 12th house. We also had Jupiter in Pisces, opposite Saturn. So we were covered there. We wanted someone who was opportunistic with Jupiter or Uranus, tending toward Uranus because of the random nature of this individual and the recklessness of his behavior. So his opportunistic nature is really apparent in Mercury conjunct Uranus and Mars square Uranus. And then we had guns. Guns was an obvious pick. This guy is focused on guns. It's his only weapon. And he is an excellent shot, so he's well trained. We know guns are going to stand out with this guy. And of course, he had the Sun square Mars, Mercury square Mars, Mars square Uranus, and Mars conjunct Neptune. And of course, the guns are found conjunct Neptune in the 12th house. Both of those things, the 12th house and Neptune, relating to sniper, Pisces 12th house Neptune rulership. We're looking for a random guy, a compulsive guy, a reckless guy, and that is definitely Uranus. So we need to see something with Uranus. We have Sun conjunct Uranus, Mercury conjunct Uranus, Mars square Uranus. So when it comes to the Mercury conjunct Uranus, we can't help but notice that it's also conjunct the Sun. So it's the Sun conjunct Mercury conjunct Uranus combination, that small stellium or cluster that tells us this individual is probably intelligent. The out-of-control recklessness comes actually from Mars square Uranus. This is a key aspect that relates to the shootings themselves and his behavior. His behavior would be Mars. The actions he takes are erratic, childish, and random. Mars square Uranus. Uranus, that planet of chaos. The ability to cross that line into the killing or torture of animals or people come from Venus square Saturn and Jupiter opposite Saturn for that cold detachment that you would need. I'd like to point out that Pluto does not play a big role in this chart, and you'll notice that Dillon only takes as many shots as necessary to either kill the individual or to ensure the individual is dead, and then he moves on. Had Pluto been involved, there would be a higher likelihood that he would take more shots at the body and to go to extremes. Dillon's overactive imagination is also attached to the shootings directly. We can see that when we're looking at his imagination with the Sun square Neptune, Moon in conjunct Neptune, Mercury square Neptune. This is one of the most prominent aspects in terms of his imagination and believing all those things about him being a special forces soldier, multimillionaire, life-saving scientist who cure AIDS, the Super Bowl winning quarterback. All of these things are especially connected to Mercury square Neptune. His actions is seen by Mars conjunct Neptune. So this is also where stress triggers the attacks because he's easily triggered with Mars conjunct Neptune. The Sun, Mercury, and Uranus forming the stellium in Cancer does not mean that he's going to be in a family. It means that family means a lot to him, and he talks a lot about family. Whether or not they talk to him is beside the point. He'd still be focused a lot on family regardless.